Lots of people in Jamaica are again calling for hanging to resume in Jamaica after a shocking mass shooting in which 8 people were killed. But why isn't Jamaica carrying out hangings right now? That's what I'm going to be talking about in this video. Thank you so much for joining me courtside. I'm Dionne Jackson-Miller. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about 3 reasons why I think Jamaica isn't hanging right now. So look, when I saw the news start to come in over WhatsApp on Sunday night, I was just stunned. Honestly, at one point, I thought I wasn't reading right because 8 people dead, 17 people shot, a baby shot, a little boy killed. No, sir, that can't real. That can't be Jamaica, except it was real and it was Jamaica. So on Sunday night, August 11, 2024, gunmen went into the community of Cherry Tree Lane in Clarendon, Jamaica, where people were playing bingo at a birthday party. And you can just imagine it. Don't just simple fun in a rural community. And then the shooting. So Jamaicans woke up, most people woke up Monday morning and just heard this news. So you can just imagine how shocked people were. I know if you heard about it before, you were shocked because the sad thing is, right, we live in a high crime environment, and honestly, we kind of become used to certain types of murders. So when you hear of a double murder or even a triple murder, it doesn't raise eyebrows nowadays in Jamaica in the way it would have in years gone by. But this was a lot. And the thing is, whenever you start to have these kinds of heinous murders or anytime you have something like this, you're going to have the conversation resume in Jamaica about capital punishment, about hanging. And I asked some people on X what they thought, if they thought that the killings in Cherry Tree Lane in Clarendon affected in any way their views on hanging, on execution as a form of punishment. So here were just a few of the comments. Reagan says, no. How does it actually solve or prevent what has happened? These young men openly admit to accepting death as an occupational risk. Then Don said, no, the death penalty will have 0 effect on crime. 0. X's Malcolm says, Section 13 of the Constitution, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the American Convention on Human Rights allow for the death penalty, despite efforts by Amnesty International to abolish it. I think human rights ought to be conditional. No lives are sacrosanct nowadays. The death penalty could be effective deterrence. What's your view? Comment below now. I'd love to hear. So remember I said I'd talk about 3 reasons why the death penalty isn't now being used in Jamaica. Reason number 1 comes out of a court case that we call Trimmingham that comes out of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It's a court case from the Privy Council, and yes, it very much governs how it is we can impose a death penalty in Jamaica. Now, I should say that some of the details are a little gory because when I describe the murder, but I have to explain that to you. If it is, we're going to understand what the Privy Council said, and then you can say whether or not you agree with it. The Trimmingham case from St. Vincent and the Grenadines is about a 68-year-old goat farmer named Albert Brown who was murdered by a man called Daniel Trimmingham. What we know about the murder came from an accomplice in the case called Ding. So on the 8th of January 2003, Ding and Trimmingham went to the community where Mr. Brown kept his goats. Trimmingham had a gun and he had decided to rob Mr. Brown. Now they saw Mr. Brown coming and Trimmingham told Ding to hide. Ding says he saw Trimmingham then have Mr. Brown on the ground, holding him up with a gun and asking him for money. Mr. Brown said, look, I don't have no money. I've given all my money to my daughter, take my goats if you leave me alone. Ding said he told Trimmingham, leave the man alone. Trimmingham says, you expect me to leave him alone and then him go and get me locked up. So Trimmingham now takes Mr. Brown a little way off, him lick him in his stomach. Mr. Brown fell down onto the bank of a rainwater ditch. Trimmingham then threw him down into the ditch, used a machete and cut his throat. He cut off his head. He then took off Mr. Brown's pants, wrapped the head in the pants and hid the head in a nearby field, banana field under a plant. He also handled his private parts and he made an obscene remark. Then Trimmingham stole 6 of Mr. Brown's goats and he and Ding tried to sell the goats. So Trimmingham was charged and he was convicted by a jury, and the judge held a sentencing hearing. Now, the prosecution had given notice that they would be seeking the death penalty. Trimmingham, it turned out, had a criminal record. He had 7 convictions for assault and he had 2 convictions for unlawful and malicious wounding. And 5 of the assaults involved using a cutlass. Now, he was sentenced to death by hanging. At sentencing, the trial judge said Trimmingham was a man who should be kept out of society entirely by the imposition of the ultimate sanction. She said this murder case was in the category of the rarest of the rare. And she said, I have no doubt that no useful purpose would be served by the continued presence of the prisoner in the community of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. A case like this justifies a retention of the death penalty as the ultimate sanction. She said, I'm convinced that the prisoner dehumanized Mr. Albert Brown in the manner in which he executed his murder. So she sentenced him to death by hanging. He then appealed to the Eastern Caribbean Court of Appeal, which dismissed his appeal. And Court of Appeal Judge Justice Barrow wrote in his judgment that the other judges agreed with. He said the death penalty can only be imposed if the judge is satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the offense calls for no other sentence but the ultimate sentence of death. In other words, he said, it's only in the worst and most extreme cases that the death penalty should be imposed, and it has to be shown that there is no other penalty that may suffice to do justice to the case. And the Court of Appeal judge said that the murder of Mr. Brown fell into the category of particularly reprehensible killings because it was committed in furtherance of a robbery. And the court also said the murder was heinous because it was cold-blooded and inhuman. Then the court looked at all the factors involved and said there was no basis on which we could say that the object of punishment is to achieve by a sentence other than death. Then the case went to the Privy Council in the UK, and the Privy Council looked at the matter. What did they say? Well, first they set out 2 principles that they said Caribbean courts had decided on in deciding whether a death penalty should be imposed. The first principle is that the death penalty should be only imposed in cases which on the facts of the offense are put into a category which are the most extreme and exceptional. That's what's called the worst of the worst or the rarest of the rare. And in deciding if a case is the worst of the worst, you're not comparing a murder case to, decent civilized behavior. You're comparing it to other murder cases. So you'd be lining up murder cases and you say, okay, is this particular one the worst of all of them? That's the kind of criteria you use in deciding on the worst of the worst. The second principle is that there must be no reasonable prospect of reform of the offender, and the object of punishment could not be achieved by any means other than the ultimate sentence of death. In other words, you can't reform this money. The only thing we can do with them is execute them. And in saying that, what did the Privy Council judges then have to say about Mr. Brown's murder? Did they regard that as being the worst of the worst? Well, they accepted, first of all, what Trimmingham's lawyer said in court. They said although it was a brutal and disgusting murder involving the cold-blooded killing of an elderly man in the course of a robbery, they said it was not a case that could be called the rarest of the rare. They said it didn't seem to have been planned or premeditated, and that they said although the manner of the killing was gruesome and violent, there was no torture of the deceased, no prolonged trauma or humiliation of him before death. And then they went on to say that it was undeniably a bad case, even a very bad case of murder for gain. But they said it falls short of being among the worst of the worst, such as to call for the ultimate penalty of capital punishment. They said Trimmingham behaved in a revolting fashion, but they said this case is not comparable with the worst cases of sadistic killings. They said they would also point out that the object of keeping him out of society entirely, which a judge said was necessary, can be achieved without executing him. So they were pointing out, for instance, that he hadn't been tortured while he was alive. He didn't go through a whole heap of pain and torture before killing him. And that went to the fact, therefore, that it couldn't be seen to be one of the worst cases of murder. So they substituted a sentence of life imprisonment for the death penalty, which the trial judge had imposed on him. So that's the Trimmingham case and the decision there. So what do you think of what the Privy Council said, and what do you think about the circumstances of that case? Do you think that's a case that would be said to be among the worst of the worst or not? Well, that decision has governed our sentencing process in Jamaica since then. So it's not that the death penalty cannot be imposed, but it's that the bar is really high. So what is the worst of the worst and the rarest of the rare? Most people would agree that killing babies does fall into that category. And that brings me to reason number 2 why the death penalty isn't being imposed in Jamaica. You may remember the so-called coca piece killings. This was a recent case in which the DPP had said she would be seeking the death penalty. And this was a terrible case. Roshane Barnett killed his cousin and her 4 children, and they were 15 years old, 12 years old, 5 years old, and 23 months old. Initially, the Director of Public Prosecutions had said she would seek the death penalty. But then Barnett pleaded guilty, and the death penalty was taken off the table. And the DPP said the Crown is obliged to remove the death penalty as an option as a matter of law. Everyone who pleads guilty is entitled to some amount of credit, meaning some kind of reduction on sentence. And the judge ended up sentencing Barnett to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole only after 55 years. No, people are cussing the judge and the sentence, but really and truly, that's a very harsh sentence. He was 23, so that means he won't be eligible for parole until he is 78, checking my math. And realistically, that very well means he may die in prison, because life expectancy for men in Jamaica is only 72. And I don't know that anybody thinks prison, especially prison in Jamaica, is a nice and healthy environment in which you can live to a ripe old age. What it does mean is that if somebody goes to trial and is found guilty, then the death penalty could still be in play if the DPP's office requests it. But if it is that they plead guilty, and the thinking around pleading guilty is that you save the government money, you save the court resources and time, you've saved relatives of the victims, and victims, if they're alive, the ordeal of a trial, so therefore you should be entitled to some kind of reduction in sentence. So if you plead guilty, the death penalty is likely then, based on what we've seen in this and other cases, to be off the table. Now, the third reason Jamaica hasn't been carrying out executions is the one we don't talk about a lot, which is that really and truly, worldwide, the trend is against capital punishment. Amnesty International, a human rights group that campaigns against the death penalty, said in its 2023 report that 112 countries have abolished the death penalty fully. 144 have abolished the death penalty in law or practice. Now, compare that to 1977, when only 16 countries had abolished the death penalty. And I should say that Jamaica, having not executed anybody for over 30 years, would be regarded as one of those countries that has abolish the death penalty in practice. Now, the politicians, they don't want to come out and abolish it in law, because that wouldn't play well politically in Jamaica. The truth is, though, that with the worldwide trend being against a resumption in hanging, plus the very high bar that has been set for us to be able to impose the death penalty, I don't think we're going to be seeing the death penalty in Jamaica again. So what do I think? I don't support the death penalty, although I completely understand when you see cases like this why people do. I do support, though, properly resourcing the police. I support dismantling gangs, solving crime, catching criminals, and very, very importantly, having effective investigations and prosecutions so that convictions will stand up on appeal. Can't stress that enough. I support social intervention programs, ensuring kids are in school, and also ensuring that young people have a path to a better life and that they don't have a choice between minimum wage jobs and scamming. I agree with Adley Duncan, who said that individual cases shouldn't change anyone's view on the death penalty. Whatever your view on the death penalty is, it should be based on ideology, not an individual case. Look, I can't even imagine what the community of Cherry Tree Lane is going through. I mean, I'm not connected with the community. I know many of you aren't, and yet we still feel the pain. Oh my gosh, when you think about what happened there. And I know we all want every one of those killers to be brought to justice. Gonna leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me courtside. I'm Dionne. See you next time.